Okay, shall we get started? So please come and take seats. And welcome to the parallel session on agricultural organic soils. So this is a regional priority in Northern Europe, and we have this parallel session because organic soils are different from mineral soils and they require different management actions. So my name is Kati Berninger. I'm from Tyrsky Consulting and I'm working for the SOMPA project that I'm responsible for communications and stakeholder collaboration in the project that is focusing on sustainable management of peatland soils. So today we talk about the agriculture part of it. So I want to welcome our first keynote speaker, who is Jørgen Olesen from Aarhus University. And he's going to talk about the role of land use and management in green transition. So he should be online. So do you hear us, Jørgen?
Yes, I do. Do you hear me?
Yes, we hear you. So welcome on stage.
Thank you very much. I hope you can also see my slides.
Yes.
Okay, super. I have to say that I'll need to call it a bit short because we're having an external audit here in 20 minutes. And I do need to be there so that we don't fail the audit. But let me just start by talking a bit about agriculture in general, because and that also, of course, goes with our organic soils and all soils, in fact. We are challenged with a growing demand for food, bioenergy, biomaterials, all of it, in fact, but also by the many negative consequences that agricultural activity has, and in fact also land use, such as nutrient pollution, greenhouse gases, biodiversity decline, and so forth. And if you look at this graph here, which illustrates those planetary pressures that have been identified, you'd see that when you have those bars going beyond that green part of the globe there, this is when it's beyond the sort of safety boundaries. And the orange part of that's the contribution of agriculture. So agriculture is, for many of those planetary pressures, really the major issue that we have. So we are challenged with many different sustainability issues, not only the climate, but also the environment, biodiversity, and what have you, and at the same time have to contribute more food, more bioenergy, more biomaterials, and so forth. In Denmark, we've been developing a roadmap on research and innovation to basically support this green transition. We had, in fact, more than 300 researchers from the universities and the industry involved in this. And we identified basically 4 different areas that we would address. One of them is land use, one plant-based food, animal-based food, and then biotech-based food. But if we look at it, it's really the land use that is so critically important, and particularly in a place like Denmark, where we have more than 60% of the entire land area in agriculture, and some of them, of course, but a bit less than 10% being the organic soils. If we look at the emissions that we have, and this is the greenhouse gas emissions from Danish agriculture, we do see that it is, for most part, it's the livestock and crop that contribute. But in fact, the LULUCF is about a third. of emissions, and that is primarily the organic soils we have there. In total, agriculture in Denmark contributes about 35% of national emissions, and given that the Parliament has set a target of a 70% reduction in total emissions by 2030 compared to 1990, there is also a considerable need for reducing agricultural emissions. So a total of 70% reduction also for agriculture would mean a reduction with about 10 million tons of CO2 equivalents per year. And here we cannot only look at the organic soil, we need to look at everything, basically, in order to meet this. However, I do think that land use and the management is actually key to achieving these goals that we have when it comes to a sustainable agriculture and also a sustainable future, in fact. There are many issues related to this. If we look at what we'd actually like to achieve here, so it's lower greenhouse gas emissions, it's greater productivity, it's reduced nutrient loadings, it's less pesticides, it's improved biodiversity. So these are multiple goals. And in fact, we have that, one of the main challenges we have is that the policies often being implemented to this don't often look at reaching many different goals at the same time. But this is in fact what we need to do. And I think to do this, we need to look at how can landscapes actually sustain this. And looking at landscape structure, I think, is an important part of it, including, of course, how we then see the peatlands and organic soils as part of that. And it's also changes in functions and management of those land parts that we do need for both productivity, but also for other ecosystem services. And it is in particular governance to facilitate change in this. And this is something I sometimes think that we actually ignore, because one critical issue here is actually to speed up the sustainable transition. I won't spend too much time on this. This is based on the Danish emissions. So I mentioned that we are looking at a reduction of 10 million tons of CO2 equivalent. That would be about the 70% reduction. Some of it we've already achieved. So a reduction of about 8 million by 2030, which you can see on the bottom row there, 8 million, could come with many different sources and reductions and so on. So these are my estimates of what could be feasible. And you'd see here organic soils, the peatlands also contribute to this. Not so much by 2030, but quite a lot by 2050. Now, we cannot totally, of course, eliminate emissions here, which is actually what is sort of foreseen here by 2050, to have all of the organic soils out of agricultural production, but we'd still have some methane emissions being left there, which actually means we cannot reach a 100% reduction. So things need to be done on all sorts of emissions to achieve the targets. But this is not all of it. What we would also need to look at is things like pesticide use and enhancing biodiversity and so on. With some of that means actually different types of land use and different types of management in order to achieve those targets, and also different technologies, in fact, and I won't go through this. The important point actually here is if we look into some of this, in some cases, it is actually some of the same systems, like perennial cropping systems, I think would be needed in order to meet many of the different targets we have here. But it's also enhancing then, if we look at the enhancing biodiversity, it's not only perennial cropping systems, it's also to make sure that there's sufficient biodiversity in those cropping systems, also with the crop plants and so on that we're using. And re-wetting, of course, is also an important part of this. Now, when we are looking into re-wetting areas, the peatlands and so on that we have in organic soils, we would often end up also re-wetting some of our mineral soils. So the area that we would actually need to be re-wetting is probably maybe 50% larger than the current extent of the peatlands and organic soils that we have. It's also, I think, important to consider that when we are dealing with emissions, and that's whether it's nutrient losses or whether it is greenhouse gas emissions, and potentially also when we're dealing with lowering pesticide consumptions and so on, we actually need to work much more with microbiological processes. Influencing those in a favorable way. And I think it's a substantial also new area of research and management that we have not sufficiently undertaken so far. But when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions, it's particularly important because it is not the livestock that emit or produce greenhouse gases. It is the microbes in the rumens of cattle. And it is the microbes in the soil that produce the nitrous oxide. It is the microbes in our manure storages that produces the methane. So it's how to basically influence those that is important. And just to illustrate, how then do we do this? Because if we look at nitrous oxide emissions, which is one of the major, and even from drained organic soils, one of the major sources of greenhouse gases. Something that I think we've been ignoring because we've been thinking all the time this is about nitrogen. Actually, it's not all about nitrogen. It's also about carbon because carbon fuels the microorganisms that produce the nitrous oxide and fuels the microorganisms that produces the conditions, the anoxic, typically conditions that also is directly needed as the environment under which nitrous oxide is produced, typically with denitrification. But we can of course influence this, and the graph here shown here is from a recent meta-analysis that we did. It was actually a meta-analysis of meta-analysis, since there's now so much information and data out there that we can actually draw very much on such analysis to see what works and what doesn't work. So we can directly influence this by how we fertilize and manure and so on, how we manage this, but also type and quality of crop residues is actually important. There's also indirect measures for this, and in particular how we influence soil structure, soil moisture, and so on is also important for those microorganisms. However, when we look at the meta-analysis we did, we'd see what actually works, what reduces emissions. That's when we get a negative value there on that graph. It's things like nitrification inhibitors and urease inhibitors and so on. It's also things like slow release fertilizer and optimizing fertilizer rates and so on, biochar even. What doesn't work is when we look at some of the agroecological management measures, such as cover crops, diversified crop rotations, and so on. In many cases, they would actually enhance emissions. So we do need to see what actually works, and we need to combine some of these to get greater efficacy of this. And of course, then look at implementing some of the technologies and management methods that works. Now, this is not organic soils, it's the mineral soils. I'd just like to also illustrate this. I would not go into re-wetting drained peatlands. I'm totally for this, and some of that, what needs to actually then be dealt with is any methane emissions and potentially also nutrient leakages, phosphorus mobilization, and so on that we need to work on with this. But I'm a bit more skeptical then on how we can enhance carbon in our mineral soils, in particular because we are also, of course, have to deal with the global warming, and the global warming in itself would deplete carbon content of our mineral soils by enhancing the microbial degradation of both the inputs and the soil organic matter that's already there. But we can work in particular with perennial crops, so that's also why I stressed the perennial crops earlier as a particularly important thing to work on. And biochar, of course, that has a greater residence time in the soils. The top graph here, this is from one of our long-term experiments with addition of straw. And of course, increasing the addition of straw to soils enhances the soil carbon content, but it approaches a new equilibrium within 15 to 20 years. So enhancing soil carbon content in the long term is particularly difficult if we just use sort of normal residues and inputs. Instead, I think we do need to look at how we can produce as much possible for food and materials, energy, and so on with the crops that we have, whether we are growing those on mineral soils, organic soils, or re-wetted peatlands, or wherever we have them. And by refining them, such bio-based materials, and using the side streams for various purposes is one way of doing this. And then recycling nutrients as fertilizers to the soil is also extremely important. However, beyond this, we do need to implement technologies and work on this and develop those at multiple scales, from landscapes to microbial manipulations to genetic manipulation of plants and livestock and what have we. And there's also a need to speed up these technological developments. They should not only look at productivity. We've had a tendency to focus on this in the past, but addressing those many other sustainability challenges that we have. And of course, there is a need to look at the safety and proper use of such technologies. But technologies are not only the only thing we need to work on. We also need to work on the many barriers for implementing the sustainable measures and technologies. That requires funding, like investments, both for the research and innovation, but also for the actual implementation. It also requires considerations for environmental health. It simply needs to be safe to use such measures and technologies. And in many cases, we're also up against existing regulations that often delays implementation of sustainable technologies. In Denmark, we are looking at various types of farm level accounting, both of greenhouse gases and nutrient leakages and what have we, in order to also foster or give some incentive to farmers for actually implementing the right ways. But the need basically to speed up the transition processes is actually acute, I think, and something that should be taken seriously. And there are many that are involved in this, and there's many aspects of this, including to have the industries and value chains and so on to support this, but also having partnerships and demonstration facilities and so on, where we can work on actually creating the right values and profitability of what we're doing here. That calls for living labs, I think. Living labs where real-world actors work with authorities, with researchers, and so on, to co-create technologies and management that actually work and which you can then upscale to the region or to the country or globally or whatever you want. In Denmark, we've created what we call the AgriFuture Innovation Partnership. And that works along all of these many different aspects, not only of the land use. And I did mention this initially, that we developed a roadmap that actually then steers this innovation partnership. Just to illustrate, I mean, because things are changing all of the time, and we're also seeing in Denmark things like solar panels popping up all over the place. It's even the idea is there also. Then when we re-wet some of our wetlands, we can put solar panels up there maybe, and then have sort of a dual use of it. Whether that is a good idea or not, I have no idea. But there are so many ideas coming up on this at the moment. I'd just like then to finish off by saying that we have this white paper from with our roadmap for this innovation partnership, the AgriFuture. You can download that white paper if you're interested. I think it would give maybe also for other countries in the Nordic quite some useful information, at least on how we're thinking. So I'll finish here.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Jørgen.
And I'm just, if there's a couple of questions, I can take them, but otherwise I need to go for that external audit.
Okay, are there any questions from the audience? Yes, please.
Ai, se ei toiminut kyllä. Joo. Okay. Thank you for a great presentation. I'm Tuuli Hakala from Valio, Finnish dairy company. I'm working in climate team and with these soil issues. And we have a lot of peatlands, drained peatlands in Finland and also in Valio's dairy farms. And how do you handle these re-wetting things in Denmark? Like if the peatlands are owned by farms, and how you like in government level or in business level, who will re-wet them, and how you can the farmer needs something, maybe money or something because then he doesn't have the field anymore.
Let me say, I mean, there are two different thoughts on how this should be done. There are some saying, okay, we just tax the farmer for their emissions and then they'll stop cultivating the peatlands. Now that is a very drastic thing, I would say, to do, and may also risk the farmers going bankrupt. In fact, because what do they do with that sort of land? But there are other schemes where farmers can apply for subsidy for re-wetting the peatlands. This is actually turned out to be a very slow process often. Because often you need to have a bigger area for re-wetting with sort of multiple stakeholders and farmers involved. So you need to agree on a project for this. It typically takes about 7 years from when you start thinking about it and making the first plans to when it is actually implemented. So this is one of the areas where I think we need to have more speedy processes on this. But in my view on this actually would be, okay, it is up to the state, the government, to basically buy this land and re-wet it eventually. I think that's the only thing that would work.
Okay, thank you. There is one more question, and then probably you need to leave.
Good morning. Thank you, Jørgen. It's Ivana from Aarhus University. So we are from the same institution, and thank you for the presentation. My question is related to yesterday. We had a very complete picture on state of art of regenerative agriculture, the main issues with the healthy soils and the carbon sequestration. From the perspective of agroecology and the work done within the Aarhus University, what do you think are the good vehicles for funding and for research innovation in that sector that could be, of course, as a sister areas, very supportive of the community that is discussing the issues here? I think we are involved very much in European partnerships, like a partnership on agroecology. Is there something that you would advise from your position? Thank you. This is a little bit more a funding-related question, but maybe of interest of the community here. Thank you.
Yeah. I think we have some challenges with regenerative agriculture. There are many positive aspects of this also for soil health and so on, but what I also try to illustrate here, we do have some challenges also when it comes to some of the emissions that are not necessarily reduced and in some cases even enhanced with these agroecological approaches in regenerative agriculture. So we need more substantive research, in fact, on how we integrate the approaches within regenerative agriculture with many of the other technologies where we, as I said, are manipulating microbiology and various other aspects that influence other emissions and nutrient leakages and whatever we have. From a funding perspective, I think we're actually in a good place when it comes to Denmark and Europe and so on. There's so much focus on this. But I would just urge that we look a bit more fundamentally at those approaches and that we have and try to link them up also with many novel technologies, in particular related to microbial manipulations.
Okay, thank you very much, Jørgen, and good luck with the audit.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
And then our next keynote speaker is Jan Peters from Sacher Foundation and Greifswald Meyer Center, Germany. And he's going to talk about agricultural used peatlands in Europe and their key role in EU Green Deal policies. Welcome, Jan.
Yeah, thank you very much and very good morning. Thanks for inviting me to this session here. And as said, I would present you actually a little bit more the policy side of things on peatlands, but I would also like to start with an introduction on peatlands, agricultural use peatlands in Europe. And I hope this works now. Yes. So we are talking a lot about soils and carbon in the soil, but I would like to start with this picture that we actually have to celebrate wet peatlands, not only for the soil and the carbon, but also for biodiversity, for water retention, for water quality filtering, for local cooling and other ecosystem services. In the morning, we have heard about resilience in times of climate change and adaptation capacities, and peatlands, beside the carbon point, are definitely one of the key actors here. what do we know about peatlands? What is the data source? Actually, we know quite a lot. We know more or less where they are. Last year, together with UNEP and FAO, we published the Global Peatland Assessment in Sharm el-Sheikh at the COP, and this also holds a quite strong Europe chapter. Here you see the map from that, and you see the distribution of peatlands, focusing on more the northern regions of Europe, and this can also go, of course, down to the parcel level. So, but why should we care about peatlands now in policy, as this talk is about, Green Deal policy? Because actually, peatlands have a quite weak role in there. They have a bad image in many countries. Probably in Finland it's different, but in many countries they have these kind of visions when people think about badlands, wastelands, whatever, not useful, where the monsters live. And we also care about have the Cinderella syndrome, because peatlands, they cover only 3% of the land in the European Union. They are quite small, also not in Finland, but in other countries, they are quite small. They are inconspicuous. They are hard to reach, hard to access. So people don't know much about it, and they are really overseen. So we have to find the right shoe for the peatlands to really recognize them. And unfortunately, peatlands in the EU member states are in a quite bad state. Recent publication shows that in Europe, 25% of all peatlands are degraded, but in the EU, actually these are 50%. Finland and the Scandinavian countries are still relatively good state, but especially you see in Central Europe, also Western Europe, and also the southern countries, the situation is quite worse. And also we have quite limited coverage of peatlands in protected areas. And this is why we are talking today about the agricultural use peatlands. Because large parts of them are used for agriculture and forestry. We just analyzed it on the basis of the inventory data for the climate inventories. And here you see the main land uses in the European member states. Of course, you know that in Finland and Scandinavia, also in the Baltic countries, we still have quite a lot of forestry on drained peatlands. Also agriculture especially in Central Europe, but also Southeast, like in Romania, we have the majority of peatlands drained for agriculture. And then we also have a bit of peat extraction in Ireland, but also in the Baltics, in Finland. And so we also see that actually the challenges on land use and peatlands are quite different in different regions of Europe. And this use for agriculture and forestry make the peatlands one of the biggest emitters of CO2 and greenhouse gases in the land use sector. So we calculated for the EU that actually only from 3% of the land, that's the inner circle, 25% of the total emissions within agricultural land use is coming from, more than, for example, from livestock management. And you also see here the circles for different countries, the top runners of peatland emitters in Europe, where you see the Netherlands, Finland, Germany, Ireland, and Baltic countries, Latvia and Lithuania. And you see there they have higher percentage of peatland in their total agricultural areas, and much larger percentage of emissions. And you see for Germany, for example, only from 7% of the land, we have 40% of emissions in the agricultural sector, which is really much more than every other source in the country from the land use sector. And this makes, and this also shows the actually international obligation Europe has, that the EU is the second largest emitter of greenhouse gases from peatlands globally, with 230 million tons CO2 equivalent per year. just after Indonesia, which is the biggest emitter. But Indonesia is doing a lot, much more than Europe, I have to say, in rewetting and restoration, also because they have more threats with fires and subsidence. And in Europe, oh, I didn't show you the figures here. We have 7% of the total EU emissions, so not only from land use, but of total emissions from peatlands, only from 3% of the land. So there is a huge key actually for emission reduction here. And this is also can be seen on the products. We already heard the question about peatland use and especially dairy products, as most of the peatlands in Europe are actually used as grasslands. And we calculated that dairy products like cheese, like butter, like milk have 4 to 5 times higher carbon footprints if they are produced on drained peatlands, drained organic soils, than from mineral soils. So we have to rethink and restore peat landscapes. So this is a quite common picture here from a polder landscape in the Netherlands, but you can find that probably all across Europe. And this is, of course, also a kind of a landscape topic and also perception of society, perception of people, which needs to be changed. If we really want to change the landscape, I really like this picture, that it is actually when we're talking about rewetting, about restoration, it's not about bringing everything back to nature, because this is, with 3% of the land, this is not possible, because there are farmers, there are people living from these lands. So on many lands, there still need to be some kind of production, what we call paludiculture. I will come later to that. And it also shows that it actually can be aesthetic, beautiful, biodiverse, wet landscapes, which can emerge under that. So what are the alternative income options? We also discussed that yesterday, that we actually need business models and economic activities on that. So it could be paludiculture, to harvest wetland crops and build up innovative value chains. But it's also about rewarding the emission reductions. So we are talking about, yesterday we heard Christian Holzleitner from the DG Klima that they are working on the carbon removal certification. So there are different ideas for carbon farming schemes, and peatlands, as they have such a huge potential for reduction, are actually should be in the focus there. But we also need, of course, adjustment of the current agricultural policy schemes. I will also come to that later. There are a lot of products which can be used from peatlands. It's not so much about food, because food production is not that easy on rewetted peatlands, but it's a lot about fibers, about biomass for construction, but also for substrates, alternatives to peat substrates in horticulture, bioenergy and construction materials. And if we look, for example, at these materials, here I show with these bars the carbon footprint of insulation materials for houses. And you see here on the right side, you see the conventional fossil-based foams and stone wool insulation materials and their footprint, and then you see the footprint of different paludiculture insulation materials, and you see that actually they have the ability to be high quality and even carbon sink products, because they reduce the soil emissions, they store the carbon from the plants in long life products, and they replace the fossil resource and energy intensive products from the value chain. And this is not even including potential new peat formation, which means then carbon sequestration. So compared to what we are producing there now with a huge carbon footprint, we can actually produce products with a sink function. So now, when it comes to the Green Deal, you probably know all this picture from the European Commission. I don't want to touch upon that. It's quite holistic, integrative framework. And I just marked in the red boxes where peatlands actually play a role. And you can see that it's almost in all fields, peatland should be integrated and play a role. And I will show you a little bit more detail here. So the Green Deal is an umbrella over different policy fields. And it's all, and we should never take that out of sight, it's all guided by international commitments the European Union and member states have, like the Paris Agreement, like the Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Framework, which we have to fulfill, also in regard to global justice. So it's the main policies here, I named them for peatlands, are the biodiversity frameworks, biodiversity strategy, nature restoration law. I will come to that a bit later. Then, of course, the climate law, Fit for 55 package, and the LULUCF regulation, which was concluded last year, and also the carbon removal and carbon farming frameworks. And we have here from last year's a reform of the LULUCF regulation. We have the target till 2030 to have a sink in the LULUCF of 310 megaton CO2 equivalent removal. We have set targets for member states, so it's in the regulation. We have to fulfill it. After 2030, there's a plan to merge the LULUCF sector with agriculture to a full sector, and it should be net zero by 2035. But we also really see from all analysis that the targets can only be reached if the sources, so the peatlands, organic soils, are not counteracting the sinks, which they are doing at the moment. So we really have to work on both. We have to reduce sources, we have to re-wet peatlands and find new ways, and we have to build up the sinks. Then we have, of course, very important for our conference here, the soil mission and the soil health law, which where the proposal from the Commission should come out in the next weeks, probably. And we have heard in the morning about, and also in the talk by Jørgen before, about living labs, that we need living labs. So there is the plan to build up, and calls are open to create 100 soil living labs all across Europe. Which are accompanied then by science and society. And I hope, and I actually call for you, that we also have quite some peatland soil living labs in that program. But we also have one grim elephant in the room, which is actually not so much part of the European Green Deal, but it's very much connected to it. And that's the common agricultural policy, the CAP, because this is actually the main driver for all peatland degradation in agriculture due to the payments for drainage-based agriculture at the moment. So these payments really counteract major policy targets for climate, for biodiversity, for water, and they are also not really included or integrated into the farm to fork strategy, which is under the Green Deal. So there is quite a strong tension between that, which I see. So why common agricultural policy? You have seen, especially in Central Europe, 50% of the EU peatlands are drained mostly for agriculture. The common agricultural policy is the single most important policy, with around 30% or more than 30% of the total EU budget funded. And peatlands are a major source of greenhouse gas in land use, which are actually not attributed in the agri sector at the moment and kind of neglected because they are in the LULUCF sector. So peatlands get poorly recognized. This is getting better, I show you in the next slide. And there are still huge barriers for paludiculture, also that is getting a bit better. So with the new CAP, which started beginning of this year, the new implementation, we at least now have the eligibility for paludiculture in the new CAP regulation. It is not recognized as agricultural activity, but still the areas used under wet conditions, wet peatlands used for paludiculture, should be eligible for direct payments under the cap in the member states. And we have a new standard for the good agriculture and environmental conditions, GAEC 2, for the protection of wetland and peatlands, which is new to actually with the target to protect carbon-rich soils, especially in peatlands. But where are we now with the implementation of the national CAP strategic plans? We see in many member states actually a delay till 2025 for implementing the GAEC, with the reason that there's not sufficient data. We have quite soft regulations, which is still allowing continued maintenance, for example, of drainage systems. All these things are still eligible for payments. And we have also quite few specific interventions for rewetting and paludiculture within the like eco schemes or eco-environmental climate schemes within the national strategic plans. And this was also stressed by the EU Court of Auditors, actually, in subsequent reports, that the CAP needs to deliver more on climate, and they specially named also peatlands and organic soils to deliver more. So there should be, or member states should really strengthen support also to reach the LULUCF targets in future. So at the moment, we have to conclude that the CAP is actually counteracting the EU Green Deal when it comes to peatlands. So next one, I would like to touch a little bit more, because it's now under hot discussion, the EU Nature Restoration Law. So there, it's an instrument for implementation of restoration of the EU 2030 biodiversity strategy, and it's recognizing the importance of peatlands for biodiversity and climate. It also emphasizes the alternative uses, such as paludiculture, in the proposal by the Commission. So it's not, and this is one misunderstanding which is also used in the discussions now to kind of block the law. It's not about renaturation. It's really about restoration of ecosystem functioning, and then use is still possible on these lands, and this is clearly set out also in the proposal. So there are specific targets under Article 9.4 prescribing restoration and rewetting for peatlands under agricultural use, and other activities of other land uses like peat extraction, forestry can be counted in a certain amount of flexibility towards the target. And this we analyzed then actually in the policy paper, which we did together with a broad coalition of research institutions all across Europe within a Waterlands project, what that actually means for the member states. So here on this graph, you can see all member states listed, and the green bar shows the area, the hectares of drained peatlands in total. So you see Finland far to the top. It's not even fitting on the graph. But then secondly, and it's quite surprising, Germany, Poland, Sweden. But you also see, and I increase it a bit, you see what actually the targets mean for the member states. And you see that actually for Finland, with these yellow to red bars, it's actually quite small obligation they have compared to Germany and Poland. Also Sweden has quite small obligations, and that is of course because the land use in these countries are much more on forestry. So there is a disproportional and diverging obligations for member states depending on the peatland use. The peatlands under forestry are mostly neglected, and there are a lot of flexibilities under discussion. And we also analyze what that actually means for the greenhouse gas emissions, these targets proposed by the law. We see here the current emissions in the countries. So Germany is top emitter, the darkest color, but also Poland, Ireland, quite high emissions. And we we looked at with IPCC numbers. We looked at the reduction potential when we apply these targets from the proposal, and we see that 2030, 2040, 2050, we still have quite high emissions in many of the member states, even with these targets. So even if we implement the targets which are proposed by the emission, we will probably fail to reach our climate goals. So the proposed rewetting targets, a large potential for greenhouse gas emission reduction is not realized. It's maximum 33%, and LULUCF targets will be hard to be reached. So we also have to see that picture. And it, of course, it also depends a lot what kind of peatlands under agricultural use we rewet. So this 33% reduction is only possible if we really prioritizing rewetting of croplands over grasslands on peat, because the reduction potential is much higher. Of course, also conflicts and challenges are higher. But we need to see this as the baseline, what we need to reach. And also there's a lot of discussion about afforestation of drained peatlands, but it's clear that this is not ecosystem restoration of peatlands, because it's not bringing back any function of the peatland. It's afforestation and nothing more. And it's really risking the long-term carbon store of the peat, which is degrading and decomposing while drained, with the midterm carbon store of the wood. Of course, there's still also a lot of knowledge gaps. We just a paper, you can find it under this link, was published by around 30 peatland scientists from all over Europe to really show the current status of knowledge there. But we still need much better life cycle assessments on peatland forestry systems, actually. So there are also, and this is also part of the Green Deal, of course, the research, the Horizon programs. I just want to name one here, the Waterlands project, under which we also published the policy brief for the nature restoration law for water-based solutions for carbon storage, people and wilderness. And it actually started 2 years ago, and has a very strong and broad partnership with 32 partners from 14 European countries. And it's focusing on restoring the services, engaging communities, aligning governance, and mobilizing financing. Also a lot with co-creation processes, management and communication and outreach. It's coordinated by the University College of Dublin. And here you see a map of all countries involved in that project. And we have action sites where in the project implementation is happening, restoration of different sites is happening, and we have the knowledge side where already we have quite good information on restoration. We have innovative practices like paludiculture, and here with the red boxes you can see the peatland related sites. You see that more than half of the sites are actually peatlands beside other wetland types. So we will actually get a strong knowledge base for further measurements also from these Green Deal projects. There are also other projects under the Horizon project or Horizon program, but not specifically under the Green Deal call. For example, Alpha Wetlands, which is a project coordinated here in Finland by Luke, also with a broad partnership, and Red Horizons, coordinated by Aarhus University, actually, where we heard the colleagues from, which both work quite a lot on the data, because there's always the issue that member states call for better data source, also better formats of data, and these projects will work and contribute to that. So we wetted peatlands in Europe are still often look like that, like wet islands in drained landscapes, which of course makes it quite difficult to maintain them and quite costly. And we hope that the EU Green Deal policies will change this in the future. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Jan. So we have time for a few questions. Were there any questions online? No. Okay, here was, I think, the first one.
Thank you for a good presentation. My name is Raisa Takita and I'm from Professional Resources in Finland. Finland is a country where we have problems of wheat soil and percentage of agricultural land. And the emissions from that area is larger than our forest carbon sink if we have any enterprises. And part of the reasons are the policy and EU-level policy, and you really nicely opened the issue with the common agricultural policy. But what you would change, what is a major thing what should be changed at the level of common agricultural policy? And if time for another question needs a life cycle analysis, you told that there is a carbon footprint of products which come from peat soil. It's 4 to 5 times larger than products based on mineral soil. But if we calculate the soil emissions, the ratio even much larger. But is there enough research on that sector, or what is the basis of this 4 or 5 times higher estimate what you gave? Thank you.
Should we first collect questions?
Well, maybe you can answer
okay,
this. It was a long question.
Already 2 questions, yeah. I mean, the first question, what to change in the CAP, is of course a very complex one and not easy to answer. I think that we really need to come to an implementation structure where there are payments really for public services, and these services from peatlands is definitely the carbon storage. So farmers need to be paid for that, and not only for the products or for the land use practice they are having on that. And we heard yesterday from Christian Holzleitner that the Commission is actually working on such schemes, which could be then also implemented as instruments within the CAP. To really incentivize carbon farming and keep the carbon in the ground, and also pay farmers for this service, and not only for any agricultural goods which are produced on that. So this is, I think, the main way, because the other ways, like what also Jørgen said, like taxing farmers for the carbon, like cutting payments completely, will only stimulate outrage of farmers, protest, and won't lead to like good innovative solutions. So I think the way is that we should use, and also farmers and farmer lobbies are also protesting against that, but I think this is something they need to accept, that we need to use the funds we have in the CAP also for rewetting, restoration of peatlands, and pay the farmers for the carbon product, so to say. So that is one thing. On the figures for the dairy products, this is, I haven't made this analysis myself, so I cannot explain fully where the data comes from, but this has been done by colleagues which are really collecting from scientific papers all available data, measurements, and it includes soil emissions, but also, of course, the methane emissions from the livestock, and kind of calculates that. And it's, of course, an average. There might also be systems with very deep drainage where the emissions are actually even higher. But we also have already dairy systems on under more extensive farming, where emissions from these grasslands are not that high anymore. So that's an average, but I think that 4 to 5 times higher, it's already quite a number, and we really have to think if we need to use the small amount of land really for that. And actually, we heard also from the youth in the morning that we anyway have to reduce livestock across the EU and change our protein supply for more plant-based products.
Okay, thank you. Now the time is running. We have time for one short question, and if you are very short, maybe one more.
Thank you. My name is Markku Ylihala, and I have retired from the University of Helsinki, Finland. I would like to know, what do you actually mean with peat soils? Do you make the equivalence between the peat soils and organic soils, or do you have another definition for a peat soil, for example, on the basis of organic carbon concentration? This has a very big importance in practice because national definitions of these soils differ quite a bit.
Yeah. No, all the maps, all the data I showed is based on organic soil definition, which is also used in the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory under LULUCF sector. So that is used here in the data analysis. Of course, you're right that there are some soils included which are under national conditions are not treated as peat soils, but as like other forms of high organic carbon content soils. But I was talking here mostly about organic soils, which are the largest proportion of peatlands across the EU.
Okay, and let's take one more, but very briefly.
I'm Frank Bundgaard from Sikkes Innovation in Denmark. In a way, I think we know what to do. But I wonder sometimes why, maybe you can answer that, why EU not are able to pay single payment to reed, bulrus, and all what's are growing in the nature. That I really wonder. And it's very simple, that is to allocate money. We are doing that now in Denmark, to taking the land out of production. It's very simple, but it's hard to convince farmers. But we know what to do, but we make it very complicated, I sometimes say. But could you answer this with the single payment scheme? I would really wonder about EU, why they can't take this decision.
A short reaction, and then we need to go forward.
Yeah, I think the reason why it can't be changed that easily in the EU, it's that actually the agricultural products, they are not directly listed in the CAP, but in some other annexes to some toll, how it's called, framework, and that is actually part of the general contracts of the EU. So if you want to change that, you have to open up a much bigger door, which at the moment nobody wants to do, and that's one of the reasons. So it has no technical reason at all. It's just an administrative, political reason actually. But I also know that the Commission is still working on that. They also know that it's what they have now, this polludiculture kind of backdoor, that it's not agricultural activity, but still eligible for single single payments. But it's that is one thing we need to work on. But I also think that is actually not the major point, because we also see that actually the importance of CAP funding will get less, and that's what we are also focusing on now. Is more working on the processing side. So from the industry side, that they take up this biomass and use it, and see actually the big benefit they have also for their carbon footprint within the production value chains, to include that, because we can also not give it just to the farmer and say, yeah, just re-wet and do something else. There need to be a market and some models for that, and that's what we are working now very strongly. And I think if that works and industries are really getting into it, then also policies will follow at some point.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jan. And then we have the first commentary by Ismo Ulvila, European Commission spokesperson in Finland. about the European Green Deal progress. Welcome.
Thank you, and many thanks to Professor Peters for already making most of my remarks. Just in a couple of words, I have some past in climate policies. I spent some 11 years at DG Klima. I was at the heart of the emission trading and international negotiations. So I'm not necessarily per se an expert in the land use and the technicalities. But nevertheless, just some comments on what has been said, and also perhaps reflecting on some of the issues that were raised. I think that in the broader context, if we think about what is the kind of like philosophical approach of the Green Deal, and what has been done before that, is that when you look at the Commission modeling. For years, it has been obvious that in order to get to the net zero, we got to have all sectors contributing. That's very evident if you look at our impact assessments, when you look at those graphical presentations on what are the pathways. And in that regard, I think it is important to understand that there's no one silver bullet that would be fitting, that would be kind of like one single solution. And that's why we have different measures, we have different architecture, trying to tackle different challenges. In the agriculture sector, in light of the numbers, it is evident that progress has not been as fast as in other sectors, say, for example, in the emission trading side, in reducing emissions. That's one thing. Then on the other hand, coming back to some issues that were mentioned there, we do have, as member states, we do have as the EU commitments, engagements at the UN level that are obliging us to raise our ambition. And it's not only in the UNFCCC context, meaning the climate framework, but it's also in the UNCPD, and which is the UN Biodiversity Convention, where just half a year ago, the EU committed to relatively ambitious and binding targets. So obviously, if one considers what has been the kind of like mirroring effect in the climate side for 2 decades now, is that we have had our own home clean. I mean, we have been implementing ambitious climate targets so that as the EU, we can then go to the UN multilateral talks and demand also the others to do as much. This was in essence how, for example, the Paris Agreement dynamics worked. And I can see the same happening at the UNCPD side. And that's why if we are committing ourselves internationally, globally, we must also ensure that we have the same actions happening domestically. And in that regard, one of the big innovations of the current Ursula von der Leyen's Commission was that, first of all, I think that we are looking different policy areas much more holistically. There's a wider assessment of the interaction and the interdependencies it's kind of like baked into the Commission proposals on how we do the proposals and what are the implications, and we try to have the wider look. And notably in the area of the Green Deal, we now have the biodiversity angle also integrated into the Green Deal. It wasn't the case in the past. And why is it so? Because obviously, and I think that's one of the conclusions that we can say is, and what is the science and peer review of the literature that shows, is that you have the co-benefits. The Restoration Commission proposal was just discussed at length. It is obvious that one of the kind of like leitmotifs, the reasonings behind our ambitious, I would say, restoration proposal is precisely in order to also have climate benefits. So it's not this or that, it's both and both are needed, and there is the synergy, which is one of the objectives in the Green Deal. The restoration proposal, which has been also subject to, I would say, a lively discussion in Finland, I think it would also contribute to a number of our climate action that we need to do at the domestic level, notably in the effort sharing and land use sectors. And as it was just mentioned, it doesn't mean the same as protection. Restoration does allow economic activity, and it is based on the national plans that the member states would then be drafting on the basis on meeting the EU level targets. So let's see, the file is now, as we just heard, subject to intense discussions in Brussels, and let's see how it goes forward from there. Now, on the other areas of the Green Deal, we have also in parallel we have the binding EU level climate law that obliges us to be at net zero by 2050. As part of that, we have also the midterm target, which is the 2040 midterm target. That is going to be somewhere between 55 and 100. The consultations are ongoing right now. We have also the other policy areas. I'm coming back to those in a moment, such as the farm to fork and so on. Thank you. On the voluntary markets that I was just told that my time is running out, but again, there I think that one of the main objectives would be, in our view, to try to make sure that there are always proper incentives in the market that the market can offer. That applies to the voluntary markets on how you are absorbing carbon within the context of our proposal that we made, hopefully with a cheaper monitoring cost. This is the essence of the carbon certification. But then also when we discuss about the future of the common agricultural policy, where the Commission will be making, the next Commission will be making early on a proposal for the future of the CAP. I think, and you rightly said that the farmers, the forest owners, they must have the proper architecture of incentives in order to make it ticking. Which kind of new instruments do we need? We already have some instruments. We have the LIFE program that is offering support in climate biodiversity areas. It has been hugely popular across the Europe. It's of course small scale. So when we think about the future, the 30 years to 2050, we have to scale up. We have to make sure that the architecture also on the agricultural side is fit for purpose, and those incentives are functional. Perhaps one last comment on the peatlands and cost efficiency. Again, this is an issue that in Finland, in the national context, has been discussed in depth. The Commission logic always starts from the principle that we should aim for the cost-effective within the architecture of the whole Green Deal, that whatever we propose has to be cost-effective, and that's why we have different measures for different sectors. But I think also that if we think about what would be one of the lowest hanging fruits in the peatlands, indeed, revetting those peatlands that have been peat extraction sites would be a number of times cheaper than, for example, to try to find those emission reductions from transport. And this is something that I think the member states, including Finland, but not only Finland, but most of the member states always in the effort sharing when we think about the national measures on how you implement these things. I think this should be the main driver on what are really those fast and cost-efficient measures. Sorry to leave it that short, but my time is up. I could have spoken for much longer time.
Thank you, Ismo. I think we don't have time for questions at the moment, but you can ask questions online on the Eventi platform, and maybe you can answer and you can go on the discussion there. Okay, thank you very much. And the next speaker is Ieva Licite, who is a project manager of Live Ogbalt, and she's from the Latvian State Forest Research Institute. And she's going to talk about the complexity of agriculture, organic soil management.
Hello, everyone. This will be one project experience, and I should warn you that there will be more questions than answers at this point of development of the project, as well as considering overall situation we are discussing here. So very briefly about project, we are from 5 countries, Baltic states, also Germany and Finland, and a lot of partners, 8 partners, including also Jan from Michael Suchov Foundation and colleagues, of course. We are working together. And about aims of this project, the main idea is to improve organic soil management, not only in agriculture, which is today's topic, but also in forestry. And with what we are dealing with nutrient-rich drained organic soil in temperate climate region, which is the widespread organic soil type in Europe. And we are dealing especially with organic soil according to IPCC definition, and this nutrient-rich part. And as I already mentioned, it's not only agriculture, it's about forest soil and management as well. And we have 3 targets. First is about greenhouse gas inventory improvements, which is very important for us to elaborate new greenhouse gas emission factors for different kind of measures. I will come later about, and demonstration of greenhouse gas mitigation measures in practice. We have established demo sites, and the third one, which is maybe today's topic, it's about policy uptake and how to convince policymakers and everyone that what we have investigated is good enough to be included in policy and to make indeed changes in policy. But a bit more about our sites. So you can see we have 17 sites in Latvia and also Finland. And just to give you background, we are doing measurements. We are indeed doing inside measurements to get more precise, as precise as possible information about greenhouse gases from different kind of management practices. And if we consider organic soil in agriculture, these are practices we are investigated. It's about polyculture. In our case, it's black alder and birch. It's also afforestation, what was mentioned by Jan, but as a possibly difficult measure. But still, we are measuring it. We are looking from this project perspective, what would the outcome be? It's about introduction of legumes in farm crop rotation, which is not maybe usually discussed measure in this framework, but still it's included in our scope. It's about controlled drainage, agroforestry, fast-growing species in riparian buffer zones, and conversion of cropland to grassland. What is important to be mentioned here is that we selected those measures in 2017, so quite a lot of time ago, and that was different understanding. If we would select measures for investigation right now, probably revetting would be part of this for sure as well. But this is with what we are dealing currently. So, and here the real complexity comes. when we started to discuss with our farmers, with our farmer advisory organizations, the first question was, okay, very interesting, but how to sell? What would be the selling point? Can farmers earn more, or what is farmers' interest point? And it's not so easy to define it. Of course, carrots always works better than sticks. We can explain about all Green Deal requirements, about everything what comes, about nature restoration law, etc., etc. But our farmer advisors, they said, no, please come with carrot, and it's first difficulty here, and it's about quite significant changes in land management. In case of Latvia, you can see map of Latvia, and it's about organic soil spread, and you can see so wide and so dispersed spreading of this soil in very small compartments all across country. And you have to deal with half of farmers' population, with half of agricultural holdings, to convince them that they should change their practice it by granddads and granddads. And it's indeed, it's quite significant complexity we can see and identify. There could be solutions. Of course, already carbon farming approach is mentioned, but this could be one point how to sell. Okay, you change your practice and you earn additional profit. Yeah, maybe. But this is about first complexity, but that's not all. Next, it's about knowledge available about greenhouse gas mitigation effects. And here you can see a graph prepared by a colleague from Luke, working also in this project. And it's about forest sites, but still, you can see that in 2013, in IPCC guidelines, in research included there, we have less data available than in 2019, when a colleague did research about research is available, review research, and okay, we can add with OrgBalt project quite a lot of information, and that is what we are striving for. Yeah, but I see that I'm too wordy. So let's go further. And it's also about a substantial lack of maps of cartographic information about organic soil spread. For example, in Baltic states, we have maps from Soviet time, and they are not up to date right now. And if you want to implement really measures that are very directly implemented with specific requirements for to be implemented in specific area, and if money is involved, you should be very convinced that this area indeed is organic soil. And we can do modeling. You can see there that these pictures there is about modeling information from our project, but this modeling information should be still supported by data from field. About next one, it's about restricted information about socioeconomic impacts. We have to compare with greenhouse gas mitigation data. We have even less information about socioeconomic data, about costs, about how to work with landowners, what to do with neighboring territories. And we are now considering mostly one pillar of three. About organic soil, I would say from our perspective what we see, and it's about environment, but a socio-economic perspective should be uncovered as well, and looking from the whole perspective. And this is my last point we want to emphasize about complexity, and it is something about political fear to take decisions. It's constantly changing regulatory situation as well, and our colleagues in ministries, they have to deal with farmers again, and at first we have to sell to to them, in fact, what we have produced. And time by time, they are also remembering that they have electorate. And electorate is very important for ministry people, so for minister, for example. So it's not so easy to sell to farmers, but it's not so easy also to sell to policymakers, even good ideas, and they are indeed fear of they feel fear of again changing situation again. If before afforestation was good, so now we have recent knowledge that maybe not so good, and you have to put additional work to work and explain that okay, now we have new best knowledge from science. And yeah, and also it's also about policy planning documents. Sometimes knowledge is coming later than policy documents. And for example, now that's my last sentence. So yeah, now we have to implement results of LifeWork BALT project in common agricultural policy, which is done and finished at the moment. And looks like we will have to wait for next iteration to do something. So yeah, it's I would say that it's easier to measure than to implement in policy later. Yeah, measurements is easiest part. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Ieva. And the next speaker is Elsa Putku, who is from the Center of Estonian Rural Research and Knowledge. And she's going to talk about enhancing sustainable use of agricultural organic soils in Estonia.
Thank you so much. Yes, I will give you briefly an introduction about the situation in Estonia. Can I have the presentation? Yes, thanks. Well, 21% of Estonia is covered with peatlands, so that makes us the second largest peatland area in the world after Finland. Now 8.3% of those peatlands are in agricultural use, in active agricultural use. And if we specifically look at croplands, then 19% of croplands are on organic soils. So this is really the focus of my today's topic, the croplands part. And just to comment on also the national inventory report, as Jan said here, also in Estonia, 13.1% of greenhouse gas emission comes from agriculture, and a quite big percent of them comes from organic soils. Let's see if the pointer also works. Okay, I can't do it. Okay. Well, anyway, in the bottom graph there are the LULUCF emissions, and in the top graphs are the agricultural sector emissions. And if we put them together, we get that 40% of greenhouse gas emissions comes from cultivated organic soils in Estonia. Good news is that last year these emissions were only 31%. But bad news is that the decrease was actually based on increase on other agricultural emissions. Then one other thing I would like to point out here is that in the National Inventory Report, they didn't use local emission factors for calculating these emissions. They used Swedish ones. And we don't have any good local emission factors. Here are 3 different studies showing organic carbon concentration and stock changes in croplands and grasslands in different soil moisture regimes. And you can see really clearly highlighted in the circles that for croplands, the organic soils are, of course, emitting carbon, the stocks are decreasing. But for grasslands, 2 studies show that they are sequestering, but 1 study is showing that it's also doing the opposite. But we really have to keep in mind that the samples behind those studies are different. We have different type of drainage systems, open ditches, underground drainage, of course, what was the initial soil types? Was it shallow peat soil or was it the deep peat soil? And we have definitely more samples on croplands because farmers were obliged to take samples from croplands. Now in the new CAP scheme, they also have to do it on grasslands, so we can get a better picture of what's happening on the grasslands. Now, LULUCF report in Estonia pointed out 5 big things to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And I would like to focus on the one in the purple color here, to decrease the emissions from cultivated organic soils. And one of the measures would be to increase the area of permanent grasslands by 2040 to 20,000, to convert them to 20,000 hectares. The other measure is paludiculture and then converting cultivated land to forest land. So let's look a little bit of the elephant. As Jan here mentioned, the CAP scheme. We have a CAP measure, a regional soil protection measure, what is designed for eroded soils and for histosols. And the main aim is, if we want to keep organic soils under agricultural use, to keep them under grasslands or to convert them to grasslands. So in the previous period, 2014 to 22, the requirement was that you have to have 90% of histosol on your field to get that payment. That meant that we had almost 40,000 hectares which was eligible for this subsidy, but only 28% of the area was covered with subsidy. This means that this wasn't actually appealing enough for the farmer to apply for this measure. And the amount of money they got was 50 euros per hectare. Now in the new CAP scheme started this year, we have changed the requirements. The histosols have to form 70% of the field area, and also organic farmers can apply for it. In the previous period, they couldn't have. And they have also increased the money. Now you can get 70 euros per hectare. So we're really excited to see what will happen this year if the farmers will go along with the changes in the scheme. But just as a background, you see the pie charts. The eligible land for this measure is actually right now mainly under grassland, and only 1/3 is cropland. But this is where actually the magic should happen, and they should turn it to grassland. And it's a 5-year obligation for the farmer. We have also a study accompanying this measure to see what happens in organic soil, and there are only 29 sites. We initially sampled them in 2015, resampled it in 2021, and you can see from the plot that the soil organic carbon concentrations are higher in grassland sites and much lower on cropland. However, you can see like a trend in decline in all of these land uses, but they weren't, of course, significant. As you know, 6 years is really not enough to show any substantial changes in the soil. But one other topic I would really like to talk about quickly, as Ieva pointed out, that we have national soil maps, really good, 1 to 10,000 scale, but they're outdated, and especially in the organic soils part, as when we manage organic soils, it of course degrades. In the center, you see a very nice dark area of histosol with high organic carbon concentration. And really focus on updating now these agricultural areas because the map is the basis for the CAP measure. We did a pre-analysis study where we showed that in the peaty soils, there is only 5% probability that we still have any peat left. And the green areas shows that we believe that 100% there should be peat even now. But right now, we are actually working with real data, with real soil samples, and we really look into the land use too. As you see, this is all one histosol area, but with the green, the land is managed as grassland, and the other color is for cropland. You can see that for cropland, the soil organic carbon concentration is 2 times lower for grasslands. And we take this into account when we update it. And the last slide, you can see now how this updated map looks like. The M area is actually what should be a histosol with a peat depth of 40 to 60 centimeters, but the measures 8.3 and 3.6 show that the organic carbon concentration is much lower, and therefore we cut it out of the map. And from all of the samples we have analyzed so far, 32.5% of the samples organic carbon is less than 12%. So we really need to do some active work on updating the map. And I would say it will definitely change the area of organic soils in Estonia too. And thank you, but just to mention quickly, this picture there is this metal pipe was put in the soil in 1975 to measure the groundwater table. They were put all over the field, and only one is left because others were stolen because of the metal. But you can see here that how much the peat layer has decreased in those decades. It's about 30 centimeters from 1975. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Elsa, and thank you all the speakers. And now we are going to have a lunch break. So the lunch is served in the conference building, and we will continue in this room at 1 o'clock, and we'll start 1 o'clock sharp. So please be here on time.